Have you ever felt like the Bible was an ancient, dead book with nothing to say about our modern day lives? What if the stories from Middle-earth, hobbits, wizards, dragons, elves, dwarves, monsters, talking trees, and magic rings could actually help us understand the story of Christianity? Could it be that Tolkien's world is a parable for something real? And could it be that our Bibles are actually full of good news for us today? We're going to be talking about all of that and more on today's episode of Theology on Air. Well, welcome back to Theology on Air. Theology on Air is an offshoot of Theology on Tap, which is a ministry here in Houston for young adults where we gather around craft beer and we talk about theology and philosophy and faith and culture and all kinds of juicy stuff. But then in the podcast, we get to dig even deeper and have guests like we have today. I am Sarah Stone. I'm the Outreach Director for Young Adults at MDPC, joined by Evan McClanahan, Senior Pastor at First Lutheran in Midtown. And we're joined today by Michael Jahosky. Michael is a Christian humanities professor at St. Petersburg College in my home state, and that's Florida, and author of The Good News of the Return of the King. This is the book that we're going to be talking about a lot today. He's married to Sarah. What a beautiful name that is. And has two kids, Lucas, who's 7, and Annabelle, who's 4. And so thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you for having me on. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I think so too. So we have lots of people in our listening audience that will nerd out about Lord of the Rings and C.S. Lewis and everything sort of in that kind of camp. And then there are plenty of people that are like, wait, which one is Lord of the Rings? Is that the one with Aslan? And you're like, no. Is that Harry Potter? No. So we're going to try to speak to everybody here at once. But before we kind of dive into the world of Middle Earth and all things magical, just tell us a little bit about you and your own story and what even got you into a place where you're writing a book about a book or a series of books.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I tell this story in the preface of my book, but what really got me hooked is twofold, my brother and my mom. So in 2001, my brother Chris started reading me the books before the first movie came out, which I think in less than a month, we're going to have the 20-year anniversary, which is really sad. It makes me feel very old of the movie. So Chris started reading me the books. I got hooked and I annoyed him through the entire first film, wondering, what was going to happen and what was going to happen next. So we started reading the books, the rest of the books, that is, after the movie was done, the first movie. And my mom actually had become a Christian again after kind of a hiatus of, kind of just asking questions and going through some health issues. And so watching her come to faith again, because I was raised Roman Catholic and I was baptized and received First Communion in the Catholic Church. We kind of came back to, unfortunately, we didn't know it at the time, but prosperity gospel. That was our first kind of reintroduction.
Yeah.
Joyce Meyer, Joel Osteen, we didn't know at the time. Yeah,
we're familiar.
Yeah. So, I was observing my mom kind of saying, wow, she's taking an interest in this again. And these two things, happened at the same time around 2001. I didn't realize there was a connection until years later when I kind of looked back and thought, how curious was it that I discovered Tolkien for the first time and then rediscovered Christianity, kind of exploring, outside of Catholicism at the same time. And what I had realized after a long journey of, college and study and, introspection is, like many people who, might be listening have experienced something similar, I discovered that I heard the gospel really for the first time, theologically sound gospel in Middle Earth. And it took me until like 2010, 11, when I read N.T. Wright for the first time to look back and kind of say, after hearing him talk about the gospel, thinking, wow, I feel like I've heard this story before. And I realized I'd heard it in Middle Earth first. And it just got me started on this journey. I had to kind of understand what Tolkien's books were doing to me and how they had kind of brought me to faith, a deeper understanding of faith without realizing it. And I think starting in around 2012, I started writing the book. It was kind of, journal notes and things, doodles here and there. And then eventually in 2015 is kind of when I first started to research and write the book formally, got my contract. I ended up having to switch publishers, and that's a whole story. But I'm grateful that the book was published eventually during the height of the pandemic.
Yeah. So interesting to pit. So in preparation for today's podcast, I rewatched all the movies because who has time to read the books? But The movies are great.
Who
And
has time to watch the movies?
Huh?
Who has time to watch the
Oh,
movies?
they're so good. And I was sick last week, so I had a couple nights where I just poured through them and cried through them, and they're so good. So if you haven't read the books or seen the movies, highly recommend. But it's so interesting to pit that narrative against prosperity gospel. I don't even have a question about that. I just
No,
what
I mean,
a sort of reversal, you know?
Oh, I know. We discovered pretty quickly that it was, not authentic Orthodox historical Christianity. And then I went to college and I'm like, oh man, this is not good. And so I kind of had to unlearn that, and very quickly, got on track with asking the right questions. So
yeah. So the thesis of the book that you wrote is basically, and you can tell me if I'm over reducing it here, but is basically that the story that Tolkien writes in Lord of the Rings over the course of those 3 books is a parable for the truth of Christianity, for the gospel. And we're going to dive into what all of that means and why you think that. And we're going to talk about parables. But before we get to that, let's just quickly do a little bit of like defining some terms, because you use some terms in here that if you don't think about what you mean by them could be sort of dangerous sounding. You use terms like myth,
confusing,
allegory, parable. Interestingly, I had never heard of Lewis's supposal, which I thought was really interesting. Like, suppose this.
Yeah,
if you do it with a British accent, So
it's not like a suppository, is it?
It's very similar, but just a small distinction that it's nothing.
That's why I'm here today. Just to offer those clarifying points. So
oh man.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, he's great. Like Gimli. He's like comic relief,
Yeah, that's right.
So maybe just tell us a little bit about any of those words you think we need to know, but especially the word parable. Later, we'll talk more about like Jesus parables, but just in general, what do you mean when you say that?
Yeah. So first of all, there's a great deal of confusion and overlap with some of these terms, and many of them kind of are pretty much synonymous. And, if you're really going to want to go deeper, you're going to want to look in my bibliography and read up on certain books. And I'm happy to recommend those toward the end of the cast today, if you'd like. But very simply, let's start with myth. I mean, myth is indirect communication. It's story. It's telling the truth or embodying truth, propositional truth. We might think of like systematic theology, if you're a Christian, theological truths, but in narrative form. Stories are the simplest definition of myth, and stories are a form of indirect communication. You think of C.S. Lewis, who said that stories sneak past the watchful dragons of the rational mind. That's kind of what indirect communication does and is. Myths are stories about the world, and they contain usually literal and true, while non-literal, truths or non-literal truths. So they're interesting to read about, and obviously can be a confusing term. But that right
because
there,
we think of the word myth as meaning that it's false.
Exactly.
Oh, that was quote just a myth, like an urban legend is a myth,
right? The myth,
but that's sort of our modern use of that term.
Yeah, and that's not at all what mythos means or meant. It obviously accumulated those sort of meanings, but not until a specific time, first in the Hellenistic period, and then much, much later in the Enlightenment, where it kind of picked up that understanding that we use today. So then, more importantly, parable and allegory, they do mean different things, but people like Klein Snodgrass, who's a top-notch biblical scholar who's written books. Klein Snodgrass has a book called Stories with Intent, which is in my bibliography, where he talks and he says, a lot of ink has been spilled about trying to separate parables and allegories into separate categories. But really what you can say of one, you can ultimately say of the other. They're forms of indirect communication. They are trying to, frame a certain reality with word pictures and trying to convey indirectly a certain something about reality. They're trying to make a point indirectly. And we can go even deeper than that, but I'm just trying to kind of skim the surface right now.
Okay. So,
there's that.
Sorry, continue.
No. I think supposal is probably the most interesting here. I've got a little quote here from C.S. Lewis. Let me see if I can track it down. So he says in one of his letters, I think it was to Mrs. Hook, I can't remember, 1958, he says, "In reality, however, Aslan is an invention giving an imaginary answer to the question, what might Christ become like if there were really a world like Narnia, and he choose to be incarnate and die and rise again in that world, as he actually has done in ours. This is not the same as allegory at all," he says. And so supposal, I would say, is very close to kind of what a parable is. It's an invitation to a hypothesis of looking at reality differently and kind of saying, imagine, or what if the kingdom of heaven looked like this? Or, a man had two sons, and it's an invitation into a new way of looking at the world. So,
yeah. I love that. And of course, you just started 2 of Jesus' parables, right? Like Jesus speaks this way a lot. And it's interesting when you grow up, maybe not everybody was this way, but, and we've talked about this a little bit. You think of parables as being something that you read, and then you do this one-to-one correspondence thing. Like, the kingdom of heaven is like a vineyard owner. Okay. The vineyard owner is God. And then, and you could really like geek out on it, be like, every grape is like a child, I don't know. At some point, sometimes it sort of seems to work. And sometimes it really doesn't seem to work. Cause you're like, well, who's the shrewd manager? Oh no. Or whatever.
Or the rude judge that only deals with the woman because she's a
nag.
Nagging him.
She won't stop bothering
so you're like,
him.
so am I supposed to be am I already nagged? This is rude. But you talk a lot in your book about kind of the role of like mystery and riddle. In fact, I was going to read a couple passages real quick that I just thought were kind of get the juices flowing on this. And it just turned out they were on page 58 and 158.
Okay. Oh, weird.
On 58, you said, what makes the parables mysterious or difficult is that they challenge us to investigate the hidden aspects of our own values, our own lives. They bring to the surface unasked questions, and they reveal answers we have always known but refuse to acknowledge. I love that. And then on page 158, the corollary, I guess, it says, that's why the Bible and the Lord of the Rings is filled with so many of the word mashalim, riddles, proverbs, and parables are natural expressions of a mind that is at home with metaphor, paradox, and dialectical thinking. Imaginative narratives, then, play a central role in communicating who God is. It's so sort of strange and a little counter to think that God would show us who he is through this kind of mysterious, imaginative, riddly, maybe less than clear at first pass way. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to say. Those are great quotes. Thank you. And I'm indebted
of yourself.
Well, yeah, but I want to say that Amy Jill Levine, Dr. Amy Jill Levine, actually is I think part of the person I quote in that first quote, or was kind of channeling there. So she's got a really good book on Jesus's parables. I highly recommend. As a Jew, bringing a Jewish perspective to these stories is invaluable. So she writes a lot about mystery. I mean, I would say first of all, we need to clarify mystery and contradiction are not the same thing. Contradiction, A is A and non-A at the same time in the same way. That's a contradiction. Well, Jesus has a human nature and Jesus is a divine nature is, well, I know sounds like a contradiction, but instead it's what some people have called a translogical truth or a paradox or a mystery. And while some scholars will split hairs over these, I'll kind of reduce it to mystery, which is something that is not incomprehensible, but it's something that needs to be revealed and kind of disclosed from a higher source. So that's what a mystery is. But I think more importantly here, what does this say about God? Why does God prefer the riddle? Why does God prefer the mashal, the proverb, the riddle, the parable? And that's because of when you actually peel back, as I've done, what a story is and how they work. Stories function through images and concrete things. And what, God is trying to say is that I know that you are limited in your thinking. You're limited in your language. You're like a little baby trying to understand the transcendent, like you're trying to understand your parent. It's like us trying to understand God. So God condescends in the very best way by speaking and accommodating to our way of thinking and grasping the world around us, knowing that we are limited in our epistemological, that is, how we can know what is true, functions. He prefers to speak about these special revealed mysteries disclose them in concrete ways that we can taste and experience. You think of all the images that are in Jesus's parables as a great example. And I think that's why God prefers that. He prefers, as biblical scholars will say, to speak through types. Types are figures or signposts that point to and gesture toward the divine. I think it says that God is a storyteller. God loves to be whimsical. He loves to play. He loves to speak in a way that we can understand him. So,
well, and that there's always room to kind of understand it more deeply.
Exactly.
Because if you think about if the Bible were written just like this happened, then this happened, then this happened. I mean, you'd read it once or twice and be so bored. Yeah, but this way you're like, wait, I never really thought about this nuance. And as you get older and more mature, you can kind of plumb the depths with your imagination.
Exactly.
What I'm thinking we should do then is, if you're making the case that Lord of the Rings is a parable, I think, and that it's actually speaking to something that's true, this greater truth, which Christianity claims, let's start with a biblical parable, and then let's move on to explain why Lord of the Rings counts. And maybe we can even give like a very broad overview of the story of Lord of the Rings for those that are like, I've never read it, you know?
Oh yeah, sure.
But
I can do my best.
Yeah. And having just watched the movies, so can I. I know there's stuff in the movies that's not in the books. I know because I did read the books, and because I have family that tells me all the things that are different. But let's unpack one of Jesus' parables just for funsies, so that people can hear kind of how you think through a parable in the way that we've just talked about. And I asked you ahead of time to think of one, and you threw two out there. One of them was the prodigal son. I'm like, overdone. I'm joking. I love the prodigal son.
I do too, but
it's an amazing story, but it is talked about more than the other one you suggested. So talk about the second one you suggested and your thoughts on it.
Yeah. Parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Luke 16:19, verses 19 through 31. And let me just start also kind of with unpacking some reasons for why Jesus speaks in parables and what they might be trying to say. And I make a case in my book that parables as a form of indirect communication, i.e. myth, are also incarnational. That is, Jesus tells stories because he's trying to suggest something about his identity, disclose something about his identity through story. That there's something about the story, the form of indirect communication that says something about who he is. And it kind of says, hey, I'm God. So God is, he's preferential to mystery, to disclosing through story. And as many scholars have made a big fuss over this, is that parables are and form what they wish to say in content. Heaven is appearing on earth. Well, Jesus doesn't want to come out and just blurt that out. And so, the criticisms that the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't have any explicit divine I am statements like the Gospel of John. That's true. They don't. But as scholars like Brant Petra, Catholic scholars, pointed out more than once, that Jesus is disclosing who he is through parables. They're incarnational stories. They're indirect communication. And the incarnation itself is indirect communication. Who expected God to show up as a man? That nothing could be more indirect than that. And so I think there's something about parables that tell us something about the heart of God. And so let me just get that out of the way first.
I love that.
Thank you. But what you were saying earlier too about the surplus of meaning that you can come back to and come back to them, we don't get that in church. Well, some churches, at least I've sat in, we should be getting that. Is that these aren't one and done stories that we can read. We can reduce them to single meanings, which is why I highly recommend Levine's book, because she really attacks this. Says, look, we're always trying to reduce it to a simple moral or to one point, or just be a better person, or watch out for those
like Aesop's fables.
Exactly. And she has issues with the anti-Semitic and anti-Judaic points, which I agree are there. Not with all commentators and pastors, of course, but that's one of her beefs. But the other is that we're just oversimplifying these stories. So, okay, so the parable of the rich man and Lazarus is loaded. I would say with Levine, I would agree, and other commentators, that while not a literal tour of the underworld, this story of a poor man whose name we know, Lazarus, who is sitting outside the gate of a rich man who's anonymous. We just know him as Dives, later Dives, Latin for rich guy. The rich man knows Lazarus's name, which kind of later condemns him in the story, right? He knows him. He does nothing to help this man who's outside his gates. He doesn't bring him in. He doesn't clothe him. He doesn't bathe him. He doesn't feed him. And Lazarus is the only named person. I don't know that there's a correlation between the Lazarus in the Gospel of John that Jesus rose now, but in case anybody was wondering, some people have speculated. But anyway, both their times come, and they both die in their own time, and there's kind of a role reversal, which is at first kind of tantalizing, is that this is what the story is about. It's about, well, when you suffer in life, you'll be rewarded in death and afterlife. And if you are, rewarded in life, you'll probably suffer. It's bad to be wealthy. It's bad to have money. And you want to be like the poor man. But who would want to be like either of them, is what Levine says. And, it's like, wow, that's a shocking point. You're like, well, you're being so mean to Lazarus. I'm like, well, but he's poor in a way that none of us understand, or very few of us understand. And nobody would say, oh, I want to be like him. And that's me. I mean, we're neither person in the story. We're kind of looking at this drama and trying to kind of say, wow, we can learn so much from both of them. I do, however, think, so my initial point about it not being a literal tour of the underworld, which is the next part of the parable, I would agree with Levine and others that there is something to be gleaned about the underworld, the afterlife, the eschatology in the parable. So I would say, while not meant to be taken completely literally, it is true while non-literal, and I think it has some implications for how we want to live our life now, and that's going to affect how we live in perpetuity and in eternal life. And so I think there's some points there. I wouldn't overlook them.
Sure.
So, but I think too many scholars make a big deal and say, oh, well, this is what happens when we die. Well, no, that's not really the point of the parable. And this is exactly the point I wanted to make, is that parables surprise, they challenge. And I'll talk about challenge parables. That's what John Crossan calls, and while I don't agree with much of his theology, he's really an outstanding parable scholar. He really is. John Dominic Crossan, who I've had the pleasure of meeting once. And he's a really cool guy. So what he says, parables are supposed to challenge, they're supposed to shake us up, they're supposed to make us uncomfortable. We're supposed to get a surplus of meaning. We're not supposed to walk away and say, okay, be like the tax collector instead of the Pharisee, like in another story in Luke's gospel, or okay, be like Lazarus instead of Dives, the rich man. It's not that simple. And it's not just, okay, I need to make sure I care for the poor and be seen giving alms and doing justice. Well, you do need to do that, but that's not all you need to do. You need to get to know people. I mean, the rich man didn't even know, well, he knew his name, but he didn't know him in a way, intimately, as a good friend, somebody who lives outside his gate does. So there's just so many things we could just go rattle on about, so many meanings. And yet there's, I think, some other even deeper disclosed meanings here that we could, reflect on about Lazarus's name too, which I believe has the word Ezer in it in Hebrew, which is the only,
Helper.
And Eve and God are the only two people in the Bible who are given.
I mean, yeah,
you're awesome. You knew this already. It's like, okay, there's kind of a jab here. It's like the only help Lazarus is going to get, says Levine, is from God, from Ezer. He's not going to get help from the rich man, as obviously he didn't. And what I think it says is that God cares about our plight, but he also cares about the rich man. He loves him enough to let him have what he ultimately wants. And one of the most haunting kind of takeaways from this parable is that, and it's a really overlooked detail, the rich man doesn't repent. He's so busy justifying himself, and he wants to save his, 5 brothers, 3 brothers, whatever.
Well, first he wants to have his tongue cooled, and then he wants to go tell them,
Yeah, that's right. That's a good detail. He looks after himself first, which is what he's always done best.
And tells Lazarus to do it too. That's the worst part. Yeah,
that's
like he's still his slave or servant somehow. Like, bro, no.
Yeah, help me out, man. But and then he says, well, if you send somebody back from the dead, and Luke's kind of add-on at the end of the parable is interesting about Jesus saying, well, they're not going to believe. They don't believe Moses and the prophets. They're not going to believe if somebody rises from the dead. It's kind of
hint, hint, wink, wink.
Yeah. I got something in my eye. So it's this. He just doesn't stop. He's still not learned his lesson, and yet God still cares for him, and enough to say. And I know this is a difficult teaching on hell, but you wanted alienation from me, and closeness to me means doing justice. The Hebrew word tzedakah, means giving alms, but also doing justice. You're getting what you wanted, and that's love, is embracing what you want. I'm not forcing myself on you, but even when you've got a chance here, maybe not to repent. I don't think there's any hint that he can, have post-mortem repentance here, but even when you have a chance to kind of say, I was wrong, you're still not saying it. So it
reminds me of that C.S. Lewis quote about people that go to heaven and people who go to hell basically both get, God gives them what they want. I'm sure he says it much better than that, but
the one you're talking about from the Great Divorce.
You can Google it,
Well, there's the one quote where there are people who say to God, thy will be done. And there are people to whom God says, thy will be done.
That's the one.
Okay. Yeah. That's the one.
Yeah. See?
Thank you.
This is a general question, and you answer it however you feel comfortable. But one of the things that I'll see happen when you have this comes up in among two particular people, and two people in particular, when they're arguing. In this case, they're sort of arguing sort of Baptist or Arminian theology and Reformed theology. And the Reformed person is saying, I'm going by the book, I'm going by the Bible, this is what the text says, this is what John 6 says, this is what Romans 9 says, whatever. And the other person sort of will argue in parables a lot. He'll say, well, it's kind of like this, and it's kind of like that, to kind of make his points. And so naturally the Reformed guy is going, hey, wait a minute, parables aren't good for basing or building a systematic theology. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I'm curious as to what you think the usefulness of a parable when it sort of comes to making concrete theological claims, not sort of the nature and person of God, but how sort of concrete can we get with parables? And again, they're not even all parables are like. Some are one sentence, some are long stories. But
that's right. And interestingly, just for those of you that are wondering that length determines a parable, scholars like Crossan have made the point that it's not brevity or length doesn't really determine it. A parable can be a sentence or phrase or a couple paragraphs. So with that out of the way, I would say systematic theology, trying to kind of put in text and squeeze out doctrines and ideas from Scripture. I don't think that that's what we should do with parables. I think if we absorb them as what they are, indirect communication, I think ultimately, yes, I think that we have to. I think if we're to really learn as Christians, especially, what they're trying to say to us, we do need to meditate and reflect on what some of the doctrines and suggestions that we might tease out are there. But I think that shouldn't be the first thing we do. And I think that usually comes in waves after we've really immersed ourselves in the parable. But Lewis and Tolkien seem to be of the mind that we need to let stories be. We need to let them be. And so I think it would be wrong to just go in there. That's why I was painfully careful. And even being painfully careful, I still am guilty of putting in some ideas and drawing ideas out, putting in Scripture and things from Tolkien's books as well. And we can't help but do it. We have to. No literature is self-interpreting. That just doesn't.
Well, we're meaning makers by nature, right?
Exactly. So I would say I'd be an advocate for letting the parables really do their work of challenging us, of if they're not shaking us up and making us uncomfortable, then we're probably trying to seek too much comfort from them, maybe trying to get some familiar ideas out of them that we've learned as Christians growing up. I don't know. That's my take on it.
So I'm going to move us along to Lord of the Rings here, because that's obviously the bulk of what your book is about. For those who maybe have not read the books or watched the movies, and maybe you can expand on this, but essentially we are looking at the story of a band of people and elves and dwarves and men and a wizard and some hobbits who are all trying to take this very destructive ring, a ring that's been made by the bad yucky force, which is sort of the evil force of the story. And they're trying to destroy it because it lures people in and it destroys them, and it could destroy all of Middle Earth. And so they're on this journey, and along the way they have to fight various wars against themselves and against others and against the dark forces, to finally get the ring destroyed so that people and all of their helpers have a chance at ongoing life. Feel free if you want to expand on that. But, and I have to say, just as a shout out, I think that for me, the crowning character of the whole thing is Samwise Gamgee. He is like the hero. I realize he's not the Christ figure, and we're going to talk more about Aragorn, who is also very dreamy. But Samwise Gamgee is just, he's always there to help. He never gives up hope. Oh, he's the best. Anyway, I recently watched these when I was going through something difficult, and I cried my way through them. So maybe I'm a little over-attached, but talk to us about how it is that you think Lord of the Rings is a parable for the truth of Christianity. I know it's a huge question. It's your whole book, but maybe walk us through that thinking some.
Sure. Yeah. So my main point to return to is that the way that truth is reflected in the story is what mattered most to Tolkien, is that he didn't want to just tell a story where people could read it and say, this is like a story I know from Samuel, and this is from Kings, and this is from Psalms, and this is from Mark, and this is from this. it's meant to be suggestive. And so one of the defining features of a parable in being a form of indirect communication or myth is that they're suggestive. And this is actually through the use of metaphorical language where there's some similarity and dissimilarity, which makes it kind of like I don't know, does Aragorn it kind of resembles like he died and then rose from the dead, but kind of not. And then sometimes in the story, there are clearer one for one, I think, one for one correspondences. I know that some Tolkien scholars would disagree with me, but I think others would agree with me in saying that there are clearer, oh, that's definitely the Eucharist, and that's definitely Mary, and that's definitely this. And Tolkien was quite explicit about it over and over again. I have deliberately created a story out of certain religious ideas. It's a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. He even says it is an allegory. And I know that that gets back into the technical realm. But again, coming back to the main point is that what mattered to him is how Christian truth was being reflected. What was being reflected was out of the question. Of course, it is a fundamentally Christian story. It wasn't even an issue. It was how it's going to be reflected. So with
before
that
you go
mind,
on, I want to interrupt and ask something that I just thought of.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe this is sort of a cheating, unfair question, but then could you say that any story where good wins out over evil is a parable for the Christian story? That feels a little bit loose. I realize that's not yet what you're saying.
No, but that's a great question. And I would say that the person wanting to get a better answer to this, and I can't answer it, is we have to have a healthy understanding of typology. Gerald R. McDermott has written he's an Anglican scholar, a great book called Everyday Glory, which I highly recommend, where he talks about the rules for kind of, okay, yeah, it's a bit of a stretch. Is every good and evil story a Christian story? I mean, aren't there other traditions that have? Yes, that's true. What he says is that there are certain rules about kind of how to know when it's more Christian and less, or that it's just kind of distantly, if all types point to Christ, if we believe that Christianity is the completely true tradition, not the religion the only religion to have truth, but the one that has the total truth, then we would expect there to be types of Christ in all of creation, including in other stories.
Sure.
And so what he says is that we need to understand how types work. And we always need to bring it back to the Bible if you're a Christian, of course, and that there are rules. And so to your point, you can't just say anything is Christian. There are certain questions he goes through, kind of like, well, does it match up with the storyline of Scripture? Does it match with the metaphysical truths of what the Bible teaches? Does it fit into the salvation story? And he goes in, gives some really good answers to this. So if anybody is interested, that's a really great side topic and totally worth looking into. So I would say that no, I mean, there are types, there are images, there are concrete things and themes in the Lord of the Rings that are definitely more universal, that you might say they don't just explicitly belong to the Christian ownership. But if you're a Christian, you really believe that Christ made us all in his image and is disclosed himself to all creation, then in a sense, it does belong to him. It's just that some types might resonate less so with Christ than others. And others, kind of like an image of the exile and returning king, might really get close and kind of really correlate with it. But whereas others are kind of distant and far off. But I think that's...
sorry to sidetrack you there, but
it's really good. I think it's a solid question worth looking into some more. I wouldn't add anything really. I mean, there's plenty to add for your overview of the Lord of the Rings, and I would say that Sam has been written about plenty of times about being a Christ figure, by the way. Lots of literature on that. So, people listening, some of my Tolkien friends and scholars out there would say, I would say that it's a salvation story. It's I think, as you have in your questions here, it's an already and not yet story, a story of, I think, God establishing his kingdom. But the understanding, even as Christians, is that suffering and sickness and death are not eliminated yet, that God is putting all enemies under his feet, and the last enemy to be defeated is death, 1 Corinthians 15. And that it's a story that really has that theme resonating very strongly with it. And I think that's what makes it really a very powerful Christian story. And so I think if we view the Lord of the Rings in that light, it is a sad story precisely because, like the Christian story, is also kind of sad. God really died. Jesus really died on the cross, but he really rose from the dead. And it's sad and it's happy at the same time. And people who have read Lord of the Rings have said the same thing about it. And we have to live in light of Christ's death and resurrection and realize that he's putting the world to rights. That's the not yet part. And I mean, there's plenty more I would add about the overview, but I mean, yeah, they win, and yet
Spoiler. Oh
Frodo,
my gosh.
big spoiler.
Been
Um,
decades, so I think we're good on that.
yeah, I think we'll be on the safe side here, but the nuances of teasing this out though are interesting. But there's a moral failure of the main character Frodo towards the end of the story and the movie. For those of you that have seen it, The Return of the King. Um, and yeah, I mean, I could just go in any direction here talking about how the story reflects it. I mean, is there anything you want me to focus on?
Well, let's talk about all of the things that aren't Aragorn, because then I want to focus in on him. So, in the Fellowship at the beginning, you have 4 hobbits, a wizard, a dwarf, an elf, a couple men, one of which, of course, is Aragorn, one of which is from the land of Gondor. And that's all of them, right? And then, of course, along the way comes Gollum, who's his own fascinating bipolar character, tortured by evil so long that he's less than human, which makes me think of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar being like a beast. Anyway, but
what's wrong, precious?
But maybe talk a little bit about some of the closer to one correlations, like Isildur and sort of where like the sort of God figure, which I guess sort of precedes the Lord of the Rings books. And then are the elves. When I was watching this time, I told myself, don't make everything one-to-one, because I had read most of your book. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to watch it and enjoy it. But I'm a theology nerd, so I can't not hear certain things. And when they talked about the orcs, which are these evil demonic sort of beings in the and they're minions of the enemy, they talk in there about how the orcs were once elves that have been sort of like perverted and chosen the other path. And the elves look very angelic in the movies, and they're described as very sort of angelic, beautiful creatures. So of course that made me think that maybe they were like the angelic, like the Elohim, the angels, and orcs were like the fallen angels. So maybe talk us through some of the like who is who, and then like who are the dwarves? What's up with them? There's a lot of stuff in your book about the dwarves that I didn't know. So
yeah, that's a lot of great topics. We're gonna go full
Sorry,
on
I just spilled a bunch of stuff, but yeah,
that's all good stuff. I'll try to pick it up one by one. I mean, so let's start with the dwarves, because that was kind of on my mind. So the dwarves were technically the first created sentient beings in Middle Earth. They were created before the elves, before men awoke, but they weren't supposed to be. So I'm familiar with Dr. Mike Heiser's Divine Council worldview. I use a lot of the research in the book. I know that's contentious scholarship, but I think that's pretty
I'm
good.
fascinated by that, and
I am too.
chatted a little bit here about it, but yeah.
Okay, so just to kind of preface that, but I would see them, what I'm about to describe, the beings known as the Valar and the Maiar, or together the Ainur.
That's in the book too.
It's in the Silmarillion, and it's in my book as well. But they've often been kind of labeled as the angelic and archangelic creatures in Middle Earth. I took a different approach. I see them as Elohim. They're God's divine family. Iluvatar is God in Middle Earth, and anyway, one of the divine family members, one of the Valar, one of the chief divine family members of God in the story, his name is Aule. He creates the dwarves because he desires to create things like himself. And when God finds out that he does this, it's kind of like a naked moment in Garden of Eden. And Aule's like, do you want me to kill them? Do you want me to destroy them? I shouldn't have done this. And he says, no, we're going to put them to sleep. But just be aware that there's going to be strife that arises between the dwarves and my children, the elves and men, in the history of Middle Earth. So it's very prophetic, and it turns out to be very true. So they go to sleep. So technically, they're kind of like with an asterisk, the first sentient beings, but then elves are the first. So elves are kind of, again, I would see they're immortal until they're not. They can they're not eternal beings. They're immortal. They can live forever and ever, but they can be
or give
killed.
up their immortality for love.
Exactly.
That was a good storyline. Continue.
Moving stuff. No, it's good. And they're kind of, I would say, they're close to the Ainur figures, and this gets real deep into Middle Earth lore. So, and I'm not an expert in that particular area, but there's some details that kind of suggest, since the elves lived on the paradise where the God's divine family originally dwelled, they are kind of like spiritual beings but they take on bodies and they become incarnate later in the world of Middle Earth. So yeah, kind of like angels, but not quite. But angels can take on human form, as we know. So yeah, I think that's somewhat appropriate. And then, men are men in Middle Earth, and then there's, Aragorn's people who are descended from Elrond's brother Elros, who gave up his elvish immortality to become man, but they have extraordinarily long life, and they all trace their lineage back to one of those junior divine beings. So there's definitely some divine council, Mike Kaiser stuff going on in the book, and I talk about that. Not that Tolkien was aware of Mike Kaiser's research, but this research, and being that it's been around for some time, Heiser's popularized it and uncovered and talked about it in a very coherent way, in a compelling way. But I think that Tolkien's Catholicism allowed him to see these, what other Christians might see as, references to the Trinity. And I think that Tolkien understood that there is a henotheistic kind of understanding in the ancient Israelite religion, and that God is, obviously incomparably great. He's the only necessary being. But he seemed to grasp, what I'm trying to say is what Heiser talks about today. And so I really make the point that we need to look at, the father of the dwarves I mentioned earlier, one of those divine beings, as not angels, but as Elohim, as you mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of fascinating mythology going on here. And I think Heiser and his research is very helpful for kind of unpacking the Lord of the Rings theology. I've gone on his podcast and done that. So that's all really cool stuff. There's a lot more who's hobbits are humanoid like, human people, and obviously extraordinarily short, and love their beer, hairy toes, pipeweed, tobacco. Their orcs are twisted. We're told in the Silmarillion they're kidnapped and twisted elves that were seduced and kind of heard the call of the dark one, or Morgoth as he's called, the first Dark Lord before Sauron comes along. And so they are twisted, and there's a lot of theology there. I mean, it's what happens when we fall away from God, and when we turn inward so much. Luther talked about incurvatus se, right? Being so inwardly curved on ourselves that we're so selfish. We become subhuman or non-human almost. And I think that's what the orcs, you might say, resemble,
Yeah.
twisted.
I mean, you actually see that on a continuum happening all throughout the books. So the orcs are sort of the final version of like what happens when you fully give yourself over, but during, various people are tempted by the draw of the evil ring. And some can easily say, nope, that's in sort of like the most honorable characters can say nope. But you watch other people kind of have a moment of, or many moments of giving over to this darkness. And then of course, like Gollum is sort of squarely in the middle, where he's like this divided character, Smeagol originally, and then now he's been just so perverted and distorted. And so it's kind of interesting to see, like, you can find yourself on that continuum somewhere. Maybe you're a little more orcish than you think, but but none of us have ever just been like, no, I've never been drawn in by evil, So that's a humanizing part of the story that I love. Talk really quickly about wizards, and then we'll move on to kingship. Because the wizard thing is so, like, one was white and then one was gray and now he's white, and about purity.
There's some really great Joseph allusions here to the multicolored coat, with the kind of way Gandalf sees Saruman at one point. And
so for those listening that don't know anything, Gandalf is a good wizard. Saruman has been taken over by the bad guy, and he's fighting for evil. So they're the two wizards in this story. And
he was originally
so we
good.
have a good one and a bad one.
Saruman, who's not the same as Sauron, who's the main guy whose name is from the Greek lizard Sauros, where we get dinosaur
lizard,
from.
just like the garden.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Glad you. The serpent. Yep. Exactly. So Saruman was originally good. Saruman the White. There is Gandalf the Gray, who's also good. Saruman eventually goes corrupt. There was Radagast the Brown, who got some attention in the Hobbit films as a kind of a contentious portrayal. But anyway, kind of as a kind of a pothead, kind of hippie, funny, but not how he is in the books.
I haven't seen those movies yet.
Oh,
I don't. I've been told not to if I liked the book. So anyway,
too many.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, people getting stoned. Goodness.
Yeah.
Although hobbits like to get stoned too.
Oh well, yeah. Sort of. So the blue wizards, there were other wizards. So we don't know much about them, but wizards are kind of again, they're part of God's divine family. They're Maiar. They're lower Elohim. And Gandalf had an original name. His name was Olorun, which kind of, he was this Holy Spirit-esque kind of force that went everywhere, kind of inspiring people, and that was his job, to kindle hope, and an Odin-like Norse figure as well. So anyway, the wizards are advisors. They're lore masters, and anyway, that's kind of who they are. But they are also part of God's divine family, but they take on angelic-like human form, and hence, old man Gandalf. So
yeah. Interesting. Okay,
Mhm.
so if the sort of crown jewel, pun intended, of the book that you wrote is that, it's in the title, right? The good news of the return of the king. We're talking about two different kings. We're talking about the king in Middle Earth, who's Aragorn. We meet him as Strider, but he's Aragorn, and he has some claim to the throne of men.
Yep.
And then slowly during the book, that gets disclosed more and more, and you see him sort of look different in the way he's described. You can talk some about what that means, but and then of course in real life, in what Christians believe is true, of course Jesus is king, and there's this idea that he came. There was incarnation, and then there's this like monarchical kind of idea. So talk us through a little bit about the character of the king in general, Aragorn and Jesus. Maybe talk a little bit about the messianic secret, and some of that transformational stuff that happened.
Oh yeah, there's a load of material there in chapter 3 of my book, which is goes through. I take kind of a retrospective journey through Tolkien's books, just for anybody who reads my book, because this is kind of how I take the posture of Jesus on the road to Emmaus, teaching us to look at Old Testament kind of in light of the risen Jesus. So I take that approach in case anybody picks up the book and realizes I don't go in chronological order. Well, I would say first, Aragorn is the primary, but not the only. I would say some might contend this, but the primary Christ figure in the Lord of the Rings. He's, I think, prophesied in some earlier books, some lesser known books I talk about in chapter 5 of my book. Your mom may be familiar with it, and some other people who are really into this stuff.
A shout out in the podcast. Continue.
Way to go, Mom. She's probably heard of the debate of Finrod and Andreth. I go into this in chapter 5. So anyway, I would say that, again, Aragorn is the primary Christ figure, but you have Frodo, you have Gandalf, you have Sam, you have several others. And kind of Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn reflect, some scholars have pointed out, the threefold Christ Christological office in Hebrews, king, prophet, priest. So in light of that, I focus on Aragorn because for me, it was a personal exploration. I wanted to explain that there was something about the image of the exiled and returning king, the prophesied king, that the Arthurian kind of like theme that just really roused my blood, and as Peter Kraft has said, put iron in my blood, and really just made me, I don't know, it just gave me this feeling of, I couldn't quite place it, joy, what Lewis talks about. And I wanted to make sense of how this character did that. So that's why I focused on him almost expressly and explicitly in the book. I don't really go into Gandalf or Frodo so much, or even Gollum. But, everything from the way that Tolkien describes Aragorn as a man of sorrows, and who has to put aside mirth, as Aragorn says several times in the book, and is ragged and weather-worn. And then there are these moments, punctuated moments, where he's seeing a relic from his history, and the people looking at Aragorn in the boat at one point early in the first book, they see that he looks taller and prouder, and his face is less pale, and there's a light in his face. And it's clear that Tolkien's going to great pains to describe, very Isaiah-like, this Christ-like figure, and who's going from the rags of ranger, Strider, to the king. So there's this almost Christ-like transfiguration. We think of the transfiguration on Mount Hermon of Christ himself. I think it was Mount Hermon. And we trace that. Aragorn goes through, I counted at least like 19 plus portions in Lord of the Rings alone, that Tolkien goes into great pains to describe Aragorn. One of my favorites is, and you don't have this in the movies, but you do kind of get it when they ride out in the second movie in the Two Towers on horses, and they're knocking over all the orcs, at Helm's Deep. Awesome scene. Well, in the books, Aragorn gets up on the parapets, and he basically just challenges all the orcs to single combat, and I think he ends up throwing something or jumping over, I can't remember, but he does something to challenge them, and they're all terrified. And Tolkien goes into this extended description of how kingly he looks, and it's just pure awesomeness, and it just makes us want to follow Jesus. For me, eventually, I made sense. It's like, I want somebody to follow. I want a cause to pledge myself to. And I realized that the gospel offers that. And so I was getting those intimations of the gospel through moments like this.
And isn't that also the scene, and this doesn't happen in the movies, but where he tells all the evil forces, you are going to be destroyed when dawn comes. Basically salvation for us is coming. And we all know that that's Gandalf, and he's bringing with him the rest of the riders of Rohan. But
exactly. That's exactly
what he says. It's really powerful. Help explain something that I didn't understand until really seminary, probably as a kid, when I was reading through the Gospels. And you see this in Lord of the Rings too. There's no accident that there are all these moments where it's like, well, my time hasn't yet come, or like, shh, don't tell anybody. And Jesus will say, like, don't, like, this isn't for everybody. And then, you know, as you get closer and closer to his death and resurrection, he becomes more and more sort of plain about who he is. But like, why the mystery? It's called this, quote, messianic secret, which maybe secret isn't quite the right word, but right, because it's like all throughout all of prophecy. So it's not much of a secret, but but there is this like slow build, and it's not yet time. It's not yet time. I mean, the first miracle that Jesus does, his mom says something to him about we're running out of wine. Can you help? And he said, my time is not yet come. But then he does what his mom asked, which was nice. If children are listening, do what your mom asks, especially if she asks you for wine. Okay. Talk to us a little bit about the messianic secret and why that's there.
Oh, it's great. I love talking about this in my book, and I wish I could have said more. But the Messianic Secret scholars like Richard Hayes have written a lot about this. Obviously, commentators focus and scholars focus on the Gospel of Mark as the chief gospel for this Messianic secret. But I would say Messianic mystery, going back to what we said earlier about what a mystery is probably better. But it's the unique way, and I think Brant Petra has written some beautiful books about this as well, that Jesus discloses through parable and riddle, kind of the same thing, who he is. And the reason is he's trying to conceal his identity to those who would do him harm and reveal it to those who are ready to listen. And there's this concealing and revealing double theme in the parables. That's what parables do, is that they will often stop people's ears and open others. And it's a lot has to do with our inner state. And so you see Aragorn kind of being described in that way throughout the book, is that his time hasn't come. He even says that on several occasions. In chapter 3 of my book, I quote, and then at one point he says, my hour has come. And this is really awesome. He challenges Sauron in one of those seeing stones, which is in the extended edition. I can't remember which movie, but anyway, it's very awesome. And it really draws heavily on the gospel. But the whole point is that it's Jesus was trying to disclose who he was in a way that was very, I know this might sound strange, but very Jewish, in a way that 21st century ears may have a hard time understanding. But parables are essential to God's character. They're essential to the way God has communicated to his people over the years. And you think of Psalm 78 too, I will utter ancient things of old. I will speak, open my mouth and speak in parables. Jesus speaks this way because his people would know that this would kind of be a way in which he would identify himself as the one. And I think that it's more than just kind of Jesus trying to be playful and, beat around the bush. But the content is in the form, is that the very fact that he's speaking in parables should clue us to say, who is this man? Who is this guy? Why is it such a mystery? Look deeper, Jesus is saying, and who do you say that I am? And I'm inviting you into this proposal to ask you that question. And I think it's just very powerful, kind of transcending more explanation, but that gets us started, No,
it's interesting. It when I hear you talk about it, it seems a lot less, I don't know. It feels like it's purposely obfuscating when you're a little kid and you're reading it and you're like, why wouldn't he want everyone to know? Like, I want everyone to know, You said that when you read the scene with Aragorn talking to the enemy and that there's this, like, he's sort of kingly looking, that inspired you because you wanted something to follow. But you talk in your book about how Western ideology makes it really difficult to get excited about kings, monarchy, royalty. I mean, we're Americans, right? We fought against all that. And
exactly.
We have a democracy or democratic republic or something, but talk a little bit about like this idea of, can we get excited about kings now in 2021 America?
I think I want to be careful in saying this. I think we can, and if we look at what a lot of Americans like to go and look at and listen to, I think that we have, as several people have pointed out in these kind of words, we have intuitions in our unconscious mind and of the Messiah. We kind of have and want um, a king. Peter Kreeft actually says this in his Philosophy of Tolkien book. He says, we don't have kings in America. We don't want them, but our unconscious mind both has them and wants them.
That's right.
And and it's just this really great paragraph he's got in the beginning of his book. And I'm like, oh, this is exactly what I felt as I was writing it. And it's like, you're right. It's not on the surface. There are political reasons. There are economic reasons. I guess there's all sorts of reasons why we don't want a king. There's historical reasons. There's spiritual reasons, but God as king is supposed to be a different form of allegiance. And I know several scholars have kind of written about this theme in really colorful, awesome ways. It is hard to get excited about it because when we put it that way, when we put it crudely, God is king in our context for several different reasons. We're at a loss and we're handicapped in being able to hear this. But N.T. Wright, who has probably been the foremost scholar who uses this kind of language, has said exactly that. He's like, for British people, it's not as hard with a constitutional monarchy and our history such as it is and our relationship with the colonies, but he says, for the rest of the world, he can sympathize, but it's a very different understanding of monarchy. But he then kind of points to the fact that look at our love of superheroes, look at our love of love stories, look at our love of stories of long forgotten ages and kingdoms that have broken down and are now kind of getting resuscitated. And the comeback story is just kind of the American story. And we love that. And so what Kreeft and Keller even has written about this, Timothy Keller's written about this too, we love about that is it's because God has planted these intuitions in our heart. They're there for a reason. It's almost kind of like an argument from desire, folks, here. We want kings. We just don't know that we do, but we really do. So
we want a good king.
Yes,
I think that's an important distinction. And it's one of the things that, stories like C.S. Lewis and watching Aragorn in the movies or reading about him in the books, you're drawn to it because from the time that he sort of denies the evil of the ring all the way through Helm's Deep, and then the final battles, like he is a trustworthy guy. He does what he says. He puts his life on the line. And so that's somebody that you could like easily surrender to. And I think that's the story of the gospel, right? Is that Jesus is a good king that we can surrender to and we can trust with our lives. We have to do that. That's how we live.
But for people who have suffered spiritual abuse, this might be particularly healing, or any kind of abuse. But it is very important distinction, Sarah. You're right that it's a good king. It's also a king that's transcendent. He's not of this world, but yet he knows this world because he made it and he made you and I. So he's not a distant fatherly or grandfatherly figure. He's not, aloof. So he knows what he's doing. And having that kind of trust with earthly parents or gatekeepers is very hard sometimes. And so I understand that it is important to highlight that this is unlike any kind of gatekeeper or leader or parent or anybody that we've ever had before. And so understanding God as our Father can kind of help us understand that. And it is tricky. It's a tough pitch, but with study and prayer and I think fellowship and lots of introspection, I think it comes to make sense. And it's not an overnight thing. Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I think that God gave us creativity and brains to be able to tell stories like this so that we can find hope when our version of it is not particularly hopeful.
Exactly.
So I'm thankful for these writers. I have many more questions, but we are kind of running out of time. Did you have any follow-up questions or funny jokes or he mentioned Luther? That was exciting.
Yes, always. Two things quickly, and no, not necessarily a question or response, but one would be you said something earlier that kind of reminded me of I think you were sort of drawn to the king. And that kind of brought you back to Christ. Like this is who kind of I want. And I think when I think about like men in the church, this kind of a big topic that comes up a lot, like 55-60% of people in church are women. And why is that? And I think it's often because, men are looking for, something more than a comforter or a healer or something, which is part of who Jesus is. But he's also like a bad dude on a like a horse that comes in like slays demons, you know? So
Exactly.
sometimes I do think that image of like Jesus as victor, not Christus victor, whole other atonement theory, but like Jesus just as victor is a needed part of the message that we need to be sharing for men. And the other one was, I actually had the opposite. You're talking about like modern, you're talking like superhero movies. Totally true. Totally get that. However, a lot of stuff like on streaming platforms where they essentially have endless budgets to make the best TV ever, right? This is the golden age of TV, these 10-part things they can air anytime. And so in theory, there's no limitations on the quality of the TV, but they're so often driven by anti-heroes. And now I think Breaking Bad's the best television show of all time, but I don't know that, but other imitations have proven to be cheap imitations. And there's something about a lot of television now that's just dark and dreary. It's just bad stuff happening, and it's moody, and it's not even dramatic. They just create mood for the sake of it, and they call it good drama. And so I think it seems like, in really, in a sense, last question, it seems like, in a sense, like all stories, like there's only one story. Like there's actually in the whole world, there's only one story. And it seems like when people make these like anti-hero dark stuff with no redemption, then they're kind of missing the one story, you know,
or rebelling against it.
Or rebelling against it. So anyway, maybe, I don't know if you have any thoughts about kind of contemporary storytelling, but.
Oh, you betcha. And I couldn't agree more with you about what you said about men in the church. This is something I personally struggled with, and kind of, you know, for all the guys out there too, who feel like, you know, if they don't fly fish or try, you know, pilot a boat sometimes, or drink Bud Light, or, you know, go horseback riding, that they're still real men. And that if you're not fantasy football or baseball, you're still a real man. You know, we need more than that for masculine, you know, for masculinity in the church. We need more of that image, as you said, beyond the comforter and the healer. And we also need to expand what a biblical definition of masculinity looks like. So I wanted to say thank you for saying that. And then, I'll give you a great example. The Walking Dead, I literally felt my everything was affected. My teaching, my marriage, my outlook, my commute, when I eventually gave up that show, because it's exactly as you said. It is a hopeless story with no redemption in sight. And I think there was probably part of the point is that they didn't want to go the Messiah route. There are a lot of false messiahs, to be sure. And I'll admit that. But I think, you know, Kirkman, or whatever his name was, the guy, sorry, I got it wrong, the guy who created the graphic novels, he was trying to do that anti-hero thing, to go in that other direction. And I agree with you. I think there are a lot of bleak, you know, knockoffs of the one true story, and they're trying to kind of say, oh, you know, we're bored with that story. What if this happened? And they're kind of like anti-supposals, you know?
Interesting.
And yeah, it's harmful. And I think it really, it impacted my outlook, and I had to stop watching it. I've talked to so many students and friends and fellow faculty who are like, man, Mike, I felt the same way. And I'm like, okay, I'm glad I'm not.
I gave up The Walking Dead too, and I gave up The Sopranos too. I
never got into it.
Yeah. But like Breaking Bad, to me, just quickly, it has some redeeming characters in it that, you know, kind of fill the gap, but the other stories didn't. It was just down the dark hole, you know, and like, oh, that's such great art, you know, we're so dark and moody and blah blah blah. I'm like,
that's cool.
It kind of makes you think there's something to that verse about whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is. But the true part is, you could stop right there to put those things into your mind, and that's exactly the point of your book. Is that when you watch or listen or read Tolkien's stories, they're talking about something true, because God is real, Jesus is King. And that's really good news. So, thank you for coming on and nerding out with us about Tolkien. And if you guys are interested in reading more of this is the book, The Good News of the Return of the King, Michael Jahosky. I would say, you didn't ask me to do this, but the first sort of half of the book talks a lot about sort of like parables and allegories and myth and different literature and devices and things like that. And the second half definitely kind of gets into the meat of the, you know, so how does Lord of the Rings do that? So if you want to skip to that, that's all I'm saying.
I would recommend it. Yeah. Sometimes.
Yeah. It's like start with season 2 of Parks and Rec, you know? No. If people want to get in touch with you and pick your brain, ask you questions, somebody actually on here asked if you had any thoughts on Dune, but I didn't ask that because I was like, we already are not going to get to all of our questions about Lord of the Rings. But if she wants to contact you, how can people find you?
www.mythicmission.com. So I have a website. I'm on Anchor. I'm on iTunes. I have a podcast, and the www.mythicmission.com has information about me, my book, links to buy the book, but also more importantly, other resources, interviews I've done, book reviews, things I've written, things I've done. So it's kind of a resource, and my social media links are on there, I believe, as well. So I've got a YouTube channel, I've got Facebook, Twitter. I got into all social media again last year, kind of had to with the book, but I'm most active on Facebook, Twitter secondly, barely at all on Instagram, but I'm on all of them. So that there's plenty of ways, and including that website. Yep.
That's awesome. And for all things Theology on Tap and Theology on Air, you can find those details at houstontot.com. And I just checked, this episode is going to air 1 week before our next live event, which is Merry Christmas, You Filthy Heretic, Old Heresies and Why They Still Matter. We're going to have some beer, we're going to have some good food, and we're going to talk about how maybe we're all heretics. So come ready to defend your being the best heretic in the room. I don't know. Anyway, but thank you for joining us. And as always, until we meet again, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.